Hello Year 7, hope you're all well, happy and safe. Just thought we'd do a quick feedback session for your progress checker that you've just all done. Some of the work you've handed in has been absolutely amazing, so thank you very much for that and well done. We'll sort out rewards and achievement points and things like that when we get back, but really impressed. So how this session's going to work is we'll just go through the questions that were on the progress checker with some good answers, sort of based on all of your answers put together, some good ones as well as my own answers too. So just work your way through the video, pause it if you need to listen again, or you can go backwards or rewind on YouTube, or however you do it. It's just generally just designed to give you some feedback quickly rather than wait until we get back, as soon as we get back. If you do have any further questions after this, please just email your teachers as always on Show My Homework, via email or on Google Classrooms. Okay, let's get cracking. Okay, so here we go. Let's get through our progress checker, some feedback. Remember, if you need to, you can always pause or rewind if I've spoken too quickly or you missed something. So the first section, we ask you to write a definition next to each of the following keywords. So as long as you've got something along these lines, then this is good. These are just sort of answers that we think are relatively straightforward and concise. So the first word or definition would be for the feudal system. So this is the new hierarchy that William brought with him when he came from Normandy. He'd used that, or it was the system used in France and Normandy, effectively ranking society from top to bottom. So we can see on this image of the feudal system here, the king at the top, then underneath him is the barons, underneath them are the knights, and then the peasants at the bottom. So that's generally how the system and society was in England. Everybody sort of worked for the person above them, owed them some sort of money or loyalty or arms, whatever it was. Generally, that's how it was. Now, in the Middle Ages, it was very unlikely that you would ever move up a rank. But it did happen, but it was very rarely. So that's the first definition that we wanted. Hierarchy. This is a ranking system, effectively best to worst or top to bottom. Usually at the top of a hierarchy, there are less people, and at the bottom there are more. So we can see that in the feudal system, there are many more peasants than there are kings. This could happen as well in a football team. So there's one manager, but loads of players. So the manager is arguably at the top of the system because he makes all the decisions. In a school, there is one head teacher at the top making decisions, and there are lots of teachers. So generally, that's how a hierarchy works. Thirdly, a peasant. It's not a very nice term. It's not a term we really use today too much, but it is a word we use to describe a very poor person. Usually, they'd be at the bottom of society or the bottom of the feudal system, and all they do, their whole life is just work the land for the knights above them. 90% of them will work the land, and the vast majority, if not all, are illiterate. That means they can't read or write. So their life is very simple, very hard, but very simple. Okay, so then we get to the nobility, or the nobles. These are people higher up in society. They're usually very rich, and they have titles such as Lord, Duke, Earl, or King, that should say. The barons are the nobility in our feudal system. Of course, we still have nobility today. We have dukes and earls and lords, and of course the queen. A monarch is a king or a queen. Very simple. It's just a word that describes the role, the king or queen. And a knight, these are given land by the nobility, which they would then rent out to the peasants. Knights would be expected to fight for the nobles or the king in a war as part of their sort of deal, their loyalty and the oath that they've sworn to the barons above them. Okay, hopefully that's cleared up some of those words. We've used them a lot already, so this is just about making them really secure in our long-term knowledge. Okay, so the other words, a protest, as we all know at the moment, is usually carried out by a large group of people who are unhappy about something and they want some change, really. Protests can be really violent or peaceful. We've seen that as well, haven't we, in the last few weeks. So the point of a protest really is to try and change a situation or stop it. Protest is usually what people say is their human rights, especially in a country where we are a democracy. But of course, it always depends on how you make your point in how successful you're going to be. So that's what a protest means. Deterrent is something designed to prevent another thing from happening for fear of punishment or death. So we try and deter you from doing something bad by saying, if you do this, you will die. Usually, so in its basic forms, not necessarily die, but be punished. This could be if you commit a crime, then you might go to jail. So the deterrent is jail. In medieval times or Tudor times even, a deterrent would be a public execution. So you probably wouldn't want to be hanged, drawn or quartered. So that might make you not do the crime or the bad act. Okay, so the Archbishop, he is a high-ranking member of the clergy. He's usually a religious leader of an individual country. So effectively like the religious boss of England, of France, of Germany, of all the different countries. An archbishop is second in the hierarchy of the Catholic Church to the Pope. The Pope is the leader of the whole thing. There is only one Pope, but there are many archbishops. I should probably just remind you as well that the word clergy basically just means high up people in the Catholic Church. So priests, bishops, archbishops and the Pope. It's just a term we use to describe the higher up members of the church, the Catholic Church. Okay, a really easy one, hopefully. Hopefully none of you struggle with this one. An heir is the next in line to inherit from their father. In history, it's usually the next in line to the throne and is supposed to be the next eldest son if possible. Now, all sorts of dodgy things go on over the course of medieval history where people get killed or disappear, or if it's a girl who's the only heir to the throne, and that generally throws up some issues as well. This can happen today. We still use the term heir today. This might be the heir to the family business. If you're the eldest sibling or child, you might take over the business, or you might inherit the house or things like that. So generally in history, the heir is the next in line to be king. And then as we go through history into more modern times, that can be a woman as well. So it could be queen. Okay, so hopefully that section 1 was fairly straightforward and you've got something similar to those answers there. So section 2 is a summary of each of these events. Okay, so the summary for who should be king in 1066, we'll keep it really brief, is that there was a succession crisis after Edward the Confessor died. He left no heir to the throne, so no son to take over. That then meant that there were 3 main claimants who decided that they thought they should rule England and become the new king. So that was Harold Godwinson, who is English, Harald Hardrada, who was a Norwegian Viking who had a long claim to the throne going back many, many years, and William, Duke of Normandy. So William, Duke of Normandy, believed that he'd been promised the throne by Edward, so did Harold, and Harald Hardrada, as we've said, he had a long claim to the throne from the Viking line. So this led to a real period of chaos and who was going to be king, which would obviously lead to the Battle of Hastings and the Battle of Stamford Bridge following in the months following. Okay, so that is a little summary of the succession crisis. Succession being who will succeed or take over, and crisis because there was nobody. All right, so this image we can see is from the Bayeux Tapestry, which shows Harold being promised the throne according to the people who made the Bayeux Tapestry. All right, so to summarise then, the Battle of Stamford Bridge. So if we remember, Battle of Stamford Bridge was the first main battle in 1066, where Harald Hardrada had arrived up north on the northeast coast, following the news that Harold Godwinson had been made king by the Witan. So the Witan were like the government at the time, high up nobles who chose Harold. So Harald Hardrada is really angry because he believes he should be king. So he comes over to England with his Viking longboats, and they are met by Harold in the Battle of Stamford Bridge. So Harold Godwinson, as you probably remember, hopefully, or you've written, was successful in this battle, and he defeated Harald Hardrada, and one of the claimants is now out of the way. This is all very good, but we must keep in mind that Harold Godwinson has already been down south waiting for William, who didn't come. He's marched up north now to meet Harold, and then he gets the news, which is just what he doesn't need, at the end of the Battle of Stamford Bridge, that William has now arrived down south. So Harold has to get all of his troops injured, tired and weary and march them down south to face William. So just a little bit of the story of this image you can see. It's always good for a bit of a laugh. the idea that the brave Viking on the bridge was stabbed from underneath and met a really grisly end. No one's really sure if that's true or not, but let's assume that it is because it's just a cool way to remember the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Okay, so the Battle of Hastings is obviously a little bit more detail. We'll talk about the essay for this shortly, but this image of the battle itself on the Bayeux Tapestry gives us a little bit of an idea of what we think happened to Harold Godwinson. So once Harold has successfully defeated Hardrada, he hears the news that William has arrived on the south coast. This is just not good news, but he's got to defend his country, so off he goes and marches down south. Harold and his weary men eventually arrive and perch themselves at the top of Senlac Hill in the south coast by Hastings, which is normally good because it's a high ground. So we'll see how this develops. William, at the bottom of the hill, he then had his archers fire arrows at Harold's shield wall, but it had no effect. A really good defensive shield wall. William then charged up the hill again with no success. It was all becoming a little bit of a stalemate. Not a lot was going on. So William tried one more time to run up the hill and charged at the shield wall, but this time the right-hand side of Harold's shield wall chased William's men down the hill. At halfway down, William's men turned round and effectively cut the English down, really leaving a massive hole now in Harold's defences. So then William tries this again, another fake retreat, and again Harold's army fell for it. They chased down the hill, and halfway down, William's men turned round and cut the rest of them down. Now we've got to remember as well a little bit of a backstory to this. They are tired. They have already just had a fight. They have been marching for hundreds of miles for weeks and weeks and weeks. And it was only a short while ago the Battle of Stamford Bridge took place. But more importantly than all of that, hopefully you'll say this in your essay, that a lot of these fighters or men that were fighting for Harold, although they're just farmers, the third, not trained really, not really soldiers, although they had the professional soldiers in the housecarls. Remember, they are just farmers, so perhaps falling for these military tactics, we could maybe let them off a little bit without judging too harshly. But anyway, as it was, they chased down. Now, the fact that Harold's shield wall has been decimated, this is where we see the end. So the archers of William's army, they fire their arrows into the air, and as the fatal shot would tell us, and we can see on this picture of the Bayeux Tapestry, an arrow entered Harold Godwinson's eye, killing him. So following the Battle of Hastings, apart from the English who managed to escape and run away, William's men just absolutely brutalised all the remaining soldiers and took control of England. That was the Norman Conquest. Okay, so 1066, that battle was in. Just to highlight again the arrow in the eye. Again, people are now suggesting, or historians are suggesting, that it didn't happen. We'll never know really. All we do know is that for sure is that William won the Battle of Hastings and conquered England. Okay, so a summary now of castles and how they helped William control England. Okay, so following the conquest, William built castles in key areas of England to control them from the English rebels. They would normally be the major towns, so London, York, as well as coastal towns, so they could maybe defend or control the coast a little bit easier. So the first of these castles were the Motte and Bailey. Now I want you all to shout as loud as you can at the screen, what is a motte not? Okay, hopefully you remember that from class. The motte is not a moat. The moat being the water or the area around the castle protecting it. The motte is the hill. Okay, so Motte and Bailey, and the Bailey part of the castle is obviously the bit at the bottom of the motte where people lived. It's like a little sort of mini village. Following the Motte and Bailey, because they were really easy to build but they were really vulnerable to rain and most importantly fire, we progressed and they built stone keep castles. So a lot of stone keep castles are still on a motte. They're still high up, but they're just basically square and made of brick instead, so they were a lot stronger than the Motte and Bailey castles made of wood. There would usually still be a bailey at the bottom, but generally the stone keep would be the bit that defended the castle and the area that the castle was built in. Following the stone keep castle, we end up with the concentric castles. These are super castles, normally with maybe up to 2 or 3 castle walls to break through. You might remember the videos that we watched in class. So once you'd managed to break through one wall, there was normally another wall to break through. It really became impossible to attack a concentric castle, except if you were going to do a siege where you just try and starve them out. That would be the only way to really get in. So the picture on the screen gives you a really good idea. Now, the best concentric castles, they might have a moat as well. They really would be quite defensive. So that's hopefully a very quick summary of castles, how they help William control England, and how they develop a little bit. All right, the next one, the importance of religion in the Middle Ages. Now, every single person was religious. Let's remember that, it's important. So some people are asking class, but what if you weren't religious, and would that affect you, and why would you be scared? And all these questions are really good questions, because today, not everybody is religious, but in the Middle Ages, everybody was. And in the Western world, which is where we live, in the West, so Western Europe, all right, so they were generally Catholic. And in the Middle East, as we know from the Crusades, they were Muslims. And a lot of the battles that took place in the Middle Ages during the Crusades were the Catholics versus the Muslims in a holy war. So anyway, everybody's religious and Catholic at this time. Most people couldn't read or write, as we've said. They were illiterate. So paintings were created that would scare them into behaving themselves and not committing crimes or not upsetting God. These were called the doom paintings, and generally speaking, they normally show monsters or demons at the bottom and angels and Jesus and God at the top. So happy at the top, but horrible, scary images of being burnt or boiled or stabbed a lot forever in hell for all of eternity. So these images would have had a really massive impact on the people. And really will have helped control them in a way, because you'd have been so scared to do anything wrong that you never committed any crimes. So remember, the church controls everything in the Middle Ages, so you just followed their instructions without question, or you'd be punished. Even thinking about questioning it, they will have felt that God would hear them and punish them anyway. It must have been really difficult, I suppose, mustn't it, to live like that? But then again, if you just didn't do anything wrong, then you probably didn't have anything to worry about. So God is responsible for everything, and we'll touch on that a little bit later on as well in the Black Death, but everything comes back to religion in the Middle Ages. All right, our next little mini story is King John and the importance of the Magna Carta. So King John made people pay more and more taxes, leading to him being really hated, particularly when they were already really poor. He is also, in many people's eyes, a bad guy, because he's stolen the throne from his brother, the hero, Richard the Lionheart, Richard I. He's off fighting in the Crusades, and he does die out fighting in the Crusades, and John quickly takes the throne. Remember how we've seen how John might be interpreted by Disney or by some of the other sources that we've read as a bit of a ruthless, callous, selfish man who really only cares about money and power. So John is not particularly liked in England by the people or by the barons and the nobles. He's also lost nearly all of his lands in France that have taken years to build up, remember? He's lost them because he's made bad decisions, or he's just not been a very effective leader. So this leads to the barons of England starting to lose a little bit of faith in him. He's not doing an awful lot right, is King John. So they forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215. This is the first document ever, really, that limits the powers of a king. It's a very significant document. It basically sets out how a country should be set up with laws and powers and things like that. Now, no one's challenged the king before, because the king, remember, is being chosen by God, is what they believe. It's called divine right monarchy. So they believe that God has chosen this man. So how can we, as people, just normal people, question the king? So it's taken us until 1215 to really start questioning and challenging the power and authority of the king. Now, the Magna Carta has formed the basis, some of you might know this, for the American Constitution. So most countries actually, in fact, have based their constitutions or the laws and rules of their land or their country on this Magna Carta of 1215. So it really is a significant document. But anyway, it limits the powers of King John, meaning he can't do some of the things that he does. Now, John, as we know, goes on to ignore, really, the Magna Carta, but it doesn't last too much longer after it. And that's a little quick summary of King John and the Magna Carta. There's plenty more to his story, whether he lost his treasure in King's Lynn and things like that. He's a really interesting guy, and obviously there are two sides to every story, so it's important that we as historians don't just accept bad King John, and we look for some evidence to say that he was good as well. He did bring loads of really good laws and fairness to England as well. Alright, so Scotland and Wales. Why did Edward I want to conquer Wales? What happened? So we need to remind ourselves that Edward I is the King of England, and he believes in feudal overlordship. He believes that England should rule Scotland and Wales as well. So following some of his fighting with his dad, who fought against the Welsh for many years, Edward I, he took over the fight as well, and he continued to fight in Wales, first of all. Alright, so he goes over to Wales and he fights and eventually defeats Llywelyn ap Gruffydd. So Llywelyn was one of the high nobles or lords of Wales. Effectively, he's the king of Wales, but not a king, but just a really important leader. So Edward I successfully and quite easily defeats him. All right. Then he turns his attention to Scotland, and this is where he'll face much stiffer opposition after fighting the Welsh. Okay, so he believes, like in Wales, that he should control Scotland. Now, really how this goes is there is a succession crisis in Scotland. So just like in 1066 when Edward the Confessor died with no heir, in Scotland, King Alexander III, he died. So that then left his daughter to be the next monarch. Now, obviously, she's a little girl, but more importantly, she was only 3 years old. As it was, Margaret died on her journey back to Scotland, so there was now nobody to take over in Scotland, which led to Edward I's Great Cause. So the Great Cause is the term we use to describe this succession crisis. Edward believed that he should choose the king of Scotland, and obviously he's going to choose someone who's going to be just loyal and subservient to him. So he chooses a guy called John Balliol in 1292. Now, this is all well and good to an extent, because it means that Edward has chosen a king up there, but people in Scotland are not very happy with this. All right, and they start to rebel, and this is where we end up with lots of little battles. The first one being the Battle of Dunbar in 1296. It's a relatively straightforward victory, mostly using cavalry. The Scottish didn't really put too much of a fight up. It's useful to know as well, Edward I has become known as the Hammerer of the Scots. That was his nickname, and he made it his final lifelong mission to destroy Scotland. He really grew to hate the Scots due to their rebellion. All right, so William Wallace became a rebel and got lots and lots of support and began fighting back against the English, and at Stirling Bridge, which is the main Scottish success, defeated the English army. Now, the whole thing did come down to a bit of a crash and end, really, for the Scots at the Battle of Bannockburn, where they were absolutely destroyed and brutalised. Although, and it is very arguable, that although the Battle of Bannockburn was a decisive victory for the English, they never really took full control of Scotland, and these battles continued for a very long time. All right, so William Wallace was eventually captured, and he was brought down to London, where he was hanged, drawn and quartered, and each quarter of him was sent to the four corners of Britain to remind them what happens when you go against the king. So that's pretty grim, isn't it, as well, which is just not very nice. So that's a little summary of why Edward wanted to conquer Wales and Scotland, and then a little overview of what did happen. We'll talk about Stirling Bridge in a sec. So then we move on to the Black Death in 1348. So obviously one of the most significant events in history, human history, but particularly in the Middle Ages. The Black Death was a serious disease. Okay, so it starts in China and it comes to Europe along the Silk Road. So we call the Silk Road because it's basically a route from China right across the continents to Europe, where people sold their goods. Okay, so like markets all along, most things being sold were like fabrics and cottons, and some luxury silks from the Middle East. And this is how we managed to trade and get things around the world. So it was called the Silk Road. That's one way that the Black Death may have came to Europe. Obviously, we know now, but they didn't know at the time, that on the ships as well, all to do with trade really, there was rats on those ships who carried the fleas with the plague on them. So there's a little idea, a reminder on how it comes. It kills up to half of Britain, so about 30 to 50% of Britain is killed, which is really an incredible amount of people. And some people even argue for the whole world, up to 3/4 of the world just wiped out. So a really, really horrific thing. So how it looks is we get our buboes under our arms and between our legs. They're really painful, and most people would die within a week. A horrible, horrible death. So people blame miasma, which was thought of as bad air. That's what made us sick. They sort of weren't wrong, because it kind of could be in the air, couldn't it? They also blame God. They blame wicked children. They blame the Jews, saying the Jews poisoned the wells. They blame the planets, and they had lots of other crazy ideas for what caused this plague. Basically, it was so dramatic and so devastating that the people were so desperate, they were willing to blame anything really, and willing to try anything. So some of the things they did was they sat in sewers. They sat in sewers because they thought the sewer was going to smell so bad that the miasma, the bad air, would go over them, would avoid them, because that smell was even worse than the bad air. They waved lavender around. Again, this was dealing with this idea of bad air, trying to make the air smell nice. Or they became flagellants, where they went round village to village, whipping themselves, punishing themselves, so that God wouldn't. But we'll talk about the flagellants shortly. Okay, so the next one, the living conditions in the Middle Ages. Now this picture gives us a little bit of an idea of what it was like to live in the Middle Ages. Muddy, animals everywhere, sort of hay, not very nice conditions. They were dirty, filthy and cramped. Loads of people living in one house, even with the animals inside. So we just know from common sense that that is not a particularly nice way to live. All right, so they threw their waste into the streets. We know that, don't we? So there'd be all sorts of poo and wee running down the streets, as well as the remains of animals. It would have become really disgusting, particularly in the summer when the heat would boil and bake it all. We know that they washed and bathed in the rivers. Sometimes as they were washing or washing their clothes, they might see some poo floating along down the river, and they didn't really connect the two, that this might cause illness. All right. However, they weren't completely disgusting. They do believe, remember, that cleanliness is next to godliness. So we might think that people in the Middle Ages were really dirty and filthy and didn't know anything about keeping clean, but they did. They really did believe that being clean was next to godliness. So they washed their hands and faces before every meal, and regularly. Maybe they didn't wash the rest of them so well, but their hands and faces definitely. Okay, so coming to the end of these sections here, the murder of Thomas Becket, one of the most important stories in the Middle Ages. Hopefully we've got our heads around this. It goes on to form quite an important part of challenging the church and the king, which, as we'll find out with Henry VIII, becomes a really big turning point in history, not just English history, but world history as well. Okay, so Thomas Becket. King Henry II and Thomas Becket are really good friends. Henry makes Thomas his chancellor. That's basically in charge of running the country, really, so finances and things like that. They really are close friends. Henry is fed up of the abuses of the church, so he believes that the church is corrupt. He thinks that people in the church are getting away with crimes, even murder, by maybe bribing the church or the bishops and the archbishops. And Henry II thinks this just isn't fair. So he tries to stop it, and he has a great idea to try and stop these abuses and corruption in the church, is he makes Thomas Archbishop of Canterbury. So remember, the Archbishop is like the sort of leader of the country for the Catholic Church in individual countries. And the Archbishop of Canterbury in Britain, he is the most powerful. We do have the Archbishop of York as well, which we'll see a little bit later in this story. He's really important, but the Archbishop of Canterbury in England is the most important. He's the one who crowns the monarch and baptises royal babies and all things like that, and does royal weddings and things like that. So the Archbishop of Canterbury is really important. So Henry thinks that if he makes Thomas the Archbishop, he's going to stop this corruption. Unfortunately, Thomas grows much more loyal to God and the church than Henry, which makes the king very, very angry. He starts following the orders of the Pope far more than Henry. So they have a bit of a fallout, really, and they don't really sort it out until 1170. In the meantime, Henry tries to make Thomas Becket sign the Constitution of Clarendon, which basically says that only the king should be allowed to excommunicate people. Not Thomas Becket, but the king. Now, this obviously takes away the power from the church, which excommunication is probably the worst thing that can happen to you. It's a threat, normally, from the Pope, or then from the Pope through the Archbishop, where you cannot go to church anymore. You cannot have the church services, so you can't have your Mass. So basically what that means is you can't be forgiven for your sins, and you can't then have Mass, which brings you in one with God and Jesus. So effectively, to really quickly summarise what excommunication means, it means you can't go to heaven. So you're being condemned or promised that you are going to go to hell when you die. And that is a really terrible thing to have over your head, isn't it? Thinking, oh my goodness, I've got to live this life no matter what I do. The Pope has basically condemned me to hell. So being excommunicated was a really, really important tool that the church has to try and control and punish people who it felt were getting a little bit too out of hand. So King Henry, he believes he should be allowed to excommunicate, not Thomas Becket, not the Archbishop. Following this Constitution of Clarendon in 1164, Thomas flees. Becket gets away to France without signing it, causing Henry to be really angry. Okay, this then leads to a little bit of an issue in between when they meet up in 1170 and they basically make up, I suppose you could say. But in between this, King Henry had the Archbishop of York perform a coronation of Prince Henry, so Henry's son, to be king when Henry dies. This makes Becket furious because it's his job, the Archbishop of Canterbury's job, to crown the monarchs. So obviously you might say, well, he shouldn't have fled to France, but still Thomas Becket is really, really angry. So anyway, a few years later they meet up in France, they make friends. Henry stays in France because he's got affairs to deal with, and he sends Thomas Becket back home thinking, oh brilliant, back to being friends, it's all going to be okay. However, when Becket gets home, he begins to excommunicate anybody who was involved in the crowning of Prince Henry. All right, now remember, when Henry hears about this, King Henry, he's not going to be happy at all, is he? Because that's not what was supposed to happen. So what generally happens then is King Henry says to himself, maybe out loud, will no one rid me of this troublesome priest? And this is one of those things sometimes that we just say. You know, we say things like, oh God, I wish such and such would happen. We don't really mean it. But actually, when he said it, his knights heard him say, will no one rid me of this troublesome priest? And his knights took that as an order. So they then went back to England. They found Thomas Becket in his palace of Canterbury, and they killed him. Okay, so they hacked him down with their swords as he was praying at the altar. One of the most grisly bits of the story is they stood on his head and his brain flew across the floor of Canterbury Cathedral. A really horrible, horrible way to die. There's other stories as well that Thomas Becket knew that the knights were there to kill him, and he didn't try to hide or escape. In fact, he had left the door open for them to come in as he was praying to do their deed. Maybe this is partly what's formed the myth of Thomas Becket and the martyr that he was. So a martyr, remember, is someone who is willing to die for what they believe in, and he was then made Saint Thomas Becket by the Pope very shortly after. Okay, so that's a little summary of the Thomas Becket story as well. Hopefully these little summaries have been quite useful and checking on what you've written yourself. Remember, if you've missed any of it, you can just rewind the video on YouTube and play it again. Okay, so then the next couple of sections were these quizzes. Okay, so this is just an example of one of your answers, but you have the quiz answers and questions in your booklet already, so you can check your answers yourself for this section, so we don't really need to go through them. But if you want, you can pause this screen and look at this particular example of section 4, but just check, if you haven't already, check your own answers. Okay, so then we get to the essay, the why did William win the Battle of Hastings essay. So hopefully this is probably the second or third time we've really thought of this question this year, having done it earlier in the year as well. Okay, so some general feedback, some really, really excellent answers handed in. Well done. Much better than the ones we did earlier in the year. You clearly have listened to feedback and you have progressed and moved on. All right, there's some really good structure in these ones, clear paragraphs, clear reasoning. You've made it really, really clear what you think, and then you've gone on to use some really good evidence as well to back it up. For example, how many miles travelled, 300 miles, different names of the armies, so the Third and the housecarls and things like that. So much, much stronger this time with the evidence. So really, really well done. And some good judgments as well. Just you've said a little bit more than we did the first time round earlier in the year. Why one of these reasons was the most important for helping William to win the Battle of Hastings. So that's the positives, but also makes it really easy to say how we can improve our answers. So some of you perhaps have just done one big paragraph. Some of you haven't maybe done enough detail or enough factual information, or no judgments either. So basically the opposite to the things you can see on the screen now. All right, but generally speaking, really, really impressed with these essays. You've clearly understood the reasons why William won. So in my opinion, I think the real reason why they won is because Harold's army were too tired and partly injured from all the marching up and down and the Battle of Stamford Bridge and all of that really made their judgments on the day not very good. That's just my opinion. And as always, one of the best things about history is that you can all have your own opinion and we can all still be right. It just depends on what the evidence is. So the next screen, you can pause this to read these. Are just two really random examples of the work that you've sent in to see good. These are two good examples of of the essay. So just pause the screen if you want to and have a little read through these, and hopefully you can pick out some of the strengths. So we talk about the structure, the judgments, the facts and the evidence. Now, probably we could find some things in this that aren't perfect, but they are really good examples, and particularly doing it independently, really, really impressed. There were lots and lots and lots and lots of really good essays handed in as well. So if you're not shown on the screen, don't worry. We've obviously made notes of the work that you've done, and we'll get all that sorted and most importantly rewarded when we get back. Okay, so this was the essay. Really, really impressed. Probably the most important part of the whole progress checker, really, because obviously we have to write a lot in history, but it's important that we write good history. All right, the last section then will be a little bit of a focus on the Black Death and its impact. So just some quick questions and then we'll be done. All right, so 5 causes of the Black Death. Children not obeying their parents is always a good one. They believe Jews poisoned the wells. The imbalanced humours. So the humours, 4 humours they believed in the Middle Ages made up our bodies. And when they were out of balance, we would get sick. So the 4 humours were blood, yellow bile, black bile and phlegm. So these are the 4 liquids that make up the human body. So if we've got too much blood, we're out of balance. So that's what makes us sick. If you've got too much phlegm, we're out of balance. Yeah, we'll recognise these things in the winter. We generally have loads and loads and loads of phlegm or snot. In the winter, don't we, have runny noses and things like that. That's the body saying there's too much phlegm, so we are sick or we get a cold or the flu. Or in the spring and summer, we might maybe have nosebleeds or we might get really red in the heat. They would say that this was because there was too much blood in the body, so that would need to be removed. One of the ways they do that is using leeches. So they put leeches on you to try and suck out some of your blood, or they would just cut you and bleed you into a little cup. But we'll do all of that in the GCSE medicine course. But that's one way that might have caused the Black Death, was our humours were imbalanced. They also thought the planets being misaligned or changing caused the Black Death. Now you will recall, you will all have seen the blood moon or the eclipses. Sometimes things happen in the sky that if you didn't know would be a little bit scary. Or comets, and probably the most famous relation to the planets for the Black Death would be Halley's Comet, allegedly flew across the sky as it does, and then a short while later the Black Death came. So many people thought it was all to do with the planets. Sort of makes sense a little bit really, but obviously not true. Bad digestion is another example. Toilets and smells, again, coming from that miasma idea. and of course God. All right, so God is the cause as a punishment for us all. So the main real thought of cause of the Black Death was miasma and God, and then some of the more desperate or silly ideas. So the next question, what was a flagellant and why did they do it? So a flagellant would whip themselves and travel round from village to village. The point of this is that they were punishing themselves, really. They may have done something that they think was wrong or that would upset God. So if they punished themselves for 33 days, walking around, whipping themselves and not eating and praying, then God wouldn't punish them with the plague. That was the idea. Probably a logical idea, but as it wasn't really God, it didn't work. Okay, so what is a pandemic? I think by now we're all experts on what a pandemic is, aren't we? A pandemic is a disease breakout that goes all around the world, not just in one area. If it was just in one area, so maybe one part of England or all of England even, as it's relatively compared to the world a small area, that would be called an epidemic. So pan meaning world, pandemic, a disease that spreads all around the world, like coronavirus. That's a pandemic. All right, so the special name given to the idea of bad air causing the plague is miasma. Okay, so miasma, that just means basically, it's an old Latin word. It means bits of bad things in the air is what makes us sick and is what's caused the Black Death. Okay, so last few. When was it? It was in 1348 when it reached England. Where did it come from? Hopefully we're really secure on this now. It comes from China along the Silk Road to Europe. And it killed 30 to 50% of England. So we think up to half of England was wiped out. So if that was today, that would kill 30 odd million people in England alone. And that's quite a scary statistic. So imagine living through the Black Death and you just didn't understand it. At least we have a little bit of an idea about coronavirus, don't we? What it might be and how to try and deal with it. Although buying 16 million toilet rolls probably isn't the greatest idea. Probably not as bad an idea as sitting in a sewer, is it? Alright, so some of the things that they tried in the Middle Ages to try and prevent or stop the Black Death. Now, it's really important to understand that prevention is something that we do to stop us getting sick, not a treatment. You can't use a prevention once you're sick. So these ideas are things they try to stop you getting sick in the first place. So they'd ask you to pray. Maybe you'd sit in the sewers, like we said before, because that would smell so bad that the miasma would not go near you and would not give you the Black Death. They'd kill all the poor cats and dogs, thinking, well, that would help. And in a way, probably did, didn't it? Because the cats and dogs weren't roaming around with fleas. But they didn't know the fleas, so we've got to remember that. Obviously, the flagellants. And then pilgrimages. People would go on pilgrimages to holy sites in the hope that they could make some offering to God or please God. I think one of the main pilgrimage sites around us is Walsingham. Some of you will be going there with Mrs. Wood on a little RE trip over the next couple of years. It's a wonderful place, but that's a really local pilgrimage site where people might go to please God. So the question, ideas they try to treat the Black Death. So let's presume that those preventions didn't work, because why would they? They would drink mercury and vinegar, which would be disgusting. And the mercury would probably do more damage than the Black Death, to be honest. But they tried, because they were so desperate, they tried all sorts of things. Strapping frogs and toads to your buboes, thinking that they would suck out the pus from the bubo, and as each frog would fill up, it would burst. And then they get another frog until all your buboes had gone away. I wondered if they noticed after the first frog that it wasn't actually working. So they also strapped shaved chicken's bottoms, a live chicken preferably, shave that, the bum, and put it on your bubo, and that would sort that out. Or they try to lance their buboes. Now that sounds really grim. A lance basically just means cut open the bubo. Alright, so cutting open the bubo would release all the pus, and they believed that that would get rid of the Black Death. So, happy days so far. They've managed to find some treatments that, of course, wouldn't work. It's quite interesting. It's funny to think some of the preventions that we've tried to deal with coronavirus, some of the things that might seem crazy, probably were the same in the Middle Ages. A lot of people will have thought, well, that's a stupid idea. But because they didn't know, and because we don't really know, they were willing to try all sorts of things. So, quite a useful comparison, really. Okay, and then lastly, for the Black Death, describe the symptoms of the Black Death across a series of days. So you would get large swellings, fever, vomiting, you would start bleeding under the skin, so you'd see large purple and black blotches, like a big bruise basically. Then you'd start having spasms, then your buboes might burst. Some people whose buboes did burst somehow, miraculously, survived. Obviously God wanted them to survive. But yeah, there was a chance that if you did burst your buboes, you might survive. And then, of course, for most people, death within 5 to 6 days. Okay, so what role has religion played in the Black Death, and how did it influence ideas on treatments, causes and preventions? So as we've said throughout this little session, the church controlled everything in the Middle Ages. It taught that the Black Death was a punishment for sins and only God could cure it. So many people did nothing, making it worse. Most of the preventions and treatments were related to religion. So they prayed, they were flagellants, they had charms, they visited holy shrines and pilgrimages. So really, almost everything they did or thought about the Black Death in relation to what caused it, how they might treat it and how they might prevent it, all comes back to religion somehow, and the teachings of the church. All right. At no point does anyone consider fleas on rats. But why would they? Because the living conditions were so bad. There's been rats everywhere. Rats live in their house. There always has been rats, and there hasn't been a Black Death before. So we need to keep that in mind, really, when we suggest why didn't they think about rats and fleas? Because they've been living with rats and fleas forever, and there wasn't a Black Death before. So we can kind of let them off again a little bit with that. All right. What was the name given to the type of plague that travelled through the air? Well, that was pneumonic plague. So once you've got the plague from the fleas and you get your buboes, that's the bubonic plague. The pneumonic plague is through the air. Now, hopefully all of you have heard of pneumonia. So pneumonia is an illness that affects the lungs. Okay, so and you breathe that in. Okay, it makes the lungs fill up with water, with liquid. So pneumonic plague is when you sneeze and cough and you put it into the air, into the atmosphere, and then people breathe it in. Now, the sad thing about pneumonic plague is it's almost 100% death, guaranteed. If you get the plague through the pneumonic plague into your lungs, then you will 100% die. Whereas with the bubonic plague, there's a little chance you might survive. Okay, so what was the impact of the Black Death on society, particularly the peasants? So it killed most of them, for starters. That's because they're poor anyway, with poor diets, so really they didn't stand a chance. But the ones that did survive, well, they suddenly become a lot more valuable to the lords and the landowners. So they could now start demanding higher wages for their services, or they just moved to the next village. Remember that half of England was killed, so they need the peasants to work the land. So they could now start saying, look, if you want me to work for you, you got to pay me, which really did go to some way to improving the lives of the peasants. It didn't make their lives 100% better, but certainly they could get a better wage. Now, one of the topics that we would have went on to do had we been in school would be the Peasants' Revolt, where they tried to put the wages of the peasants back to the year before the Black Death and raise poll tax at the same time. So as you can imagine, as we've seen in the protests recently, the people weren't very happy. So the Peasants' Revolt in 1381 was a little skirmish, shall we say, that nearly led to the peasants taking control of London. As it was, the peasants failed, but they made their point very, very clear. Lots of people lost their heads, and the poll tax was dealt with by King Richard II. Okay, so that's a bit of a link really to the Black Death, that the peasants were getting a little bit of a better situation, and then later on, about 40 years later, they tried to reduce the wages again, which is not going to happen, is it? Alright, so thank you for your time listening to this feedback session, and thank you very much for your efforts during the lockdown. Some of the work that you are sending is just phenomenal. Just keep it up. We've got the Tudor book left to do now, haven't we, before we get back in September, hopefully. So just keep working through that. So if you haven't yet handed in your work, your progress checker, you can still do that on Google Classroom, email it to your teachers, or hand it in on Show My Homework. The actual work that you've been doing, so the lessons PowerPoints that are on Google Classroom or in the Year 7 section of stchistory.com, you can still send photographs of your work. If you scan your work, you can send us the scans by email or Google Classroom. or if you've been doing all your work on Microsoft Office or any sort of document, you can digitally send that to us by email as well. We are collating all of your work in folders to keep it all safe. Everything you send gets put in a little folder with your name on it, or if you're keeping your work yourself, keep it all organised, and then you want to bring that in when we get back, then that's fine as well. Ideally, we would like to have everybody's progress checker handed in and at least looked at before we get back and put in our mark books. Okay, so your Tudors workbook that you've now got to work through, some of you have got paper copies of that, most of you have got the digital PowerPoint version so you can write on and edit that. Don't rush it, just take your time, do it properly. The Tudors are a really important part of everything else we learn in Year 8, Year 9, Year 10 and Year 11. So we've got to try our best to get at least some context to the Tudor period properly. So if we go to our department website, stchistory.com, and click on links at the top, there's a few little options. You'll see links, and find the Elizabeth section. There's lots of links to Tudor websites there to help you with some of the independent tasks in that Tudor booklet. I do recommend that you try and be specific when you search for things. So, for example, who were Henry VIII's 6 wives? Don't just Google Henry's wives. So it'll give you something more specific. So something like, where did the Reformation start? Don't just put Reformation in. So if you've got some specific questions that you're trying to ask, to answer the questions in the booklet, try and be specific. And of course, folks, don't forget, we are here, standing by, ready to answer your questions. If you're stuck, by email, Show My Homework, or Google Classroom, or whatever way you need to, let us know, and we are there to help you. So, just to bring this to a little bit of an end, thanks again. Really enjoying your work coming in. Keep it coming, because it's just brilliant. And we'll hopefully see you all really, really soon. So take care and stay safe, and stay happy, and we'll see you soon. Alright, thanks again guys. Take care, bye bye.